Hello, Mr. Begich. How are you?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Good to meet you. I'm Murat Demir. I'm the copy editor and reporter from the Northern Light, and this is my colleague Beck.
Hi, Beck.
I'm a new reporter, so forgive me if I mess something up.
Well, it's good to meet you for one, and
Thank you, Murat.
I appreciate you taking time to speak with us at
Sure.
this hour. It's not too late, I guess, but so I recently watched another interview you did with someone. It was kind of like an obscure video from 4 months ago on YouTube with, I think, Off the Glacier News.
Which one?
I think it was Off the Glacier News.
Man, I don't. I mean, I've done a lot, but there was. Was I sitting at a table
Yes,
or was I
you were.
sitting side by side with the person?
You were at a table.
Yeah, and I was kind of leaning in and slouching a little bit.
Yeah, it was a great interview, I gotta say, and you said some things that I think that you don't really hear candidates or politicians saying too frequently, which I thought was interesting to hear, and I wanted to kind of ask you
Sure.
about that. But first, I want to ask you. I was also reading about you, and you mentioned that you're a musician, and I
hmm
wanted to ask how your life as a musician and singer-songwriter kind of blends in with your public life or what you've done publicly.
Well, if you were looking at the chat in the last conversation, you would have noted at the very end, Rogelio said a shout out to Tom for bringing his guitar to our class out here in Bethel, which I did in fact do because I was there the first time I went to Bethel. I got to tour the school, the particular school there, and there were a lot of folks in from Kipnuk because of you know, the the typhoon that had hit the place and the damage that had been done. So kids were recovering there, and they were settling with family, extended family. But I noticed that they had guitars, and so I said, "Hey, if you guys are up for it, I'd be glad to come back next time and teach class. If you're into it." And what I found was, in fact, the kids were ready to teach themselves. I brought the guitar. It's a little guitar I can put together. That was kind of fascinating for them all. It's a travel guitar. And then there were at least three students who had a little bit of skill, so I had them show their skill to the other students. It's a good way of showing that just because you're the feature or the person who came into the room, there's ways that you can empower the people that are in the room to within their own peer group, so that there's a peer-to-peer level of I guess knowledge and understanding and connection. And then later that night, I was asked to play. My wife and I both performed and asked us to play at the open mic, which we did do at a pizza place in Bethel. So that was kind of fun too. A lot of different people, everyone's talking, but look, the music has always grounded me since I was a kid. It was after my father passed away, it was one of the one of my refuges, places where I found solace. And writing, and it means that you have to, if you're writing well, and I think I write okay, it's about observing, it's about hearing, it's not about shoving something at somebody, it's about absorbing what you're feeling around whatever you're doing in terms of work. I've done some pretty really rough work in terms of some of the places and things I've worked on. So it's a way of actually alleviating some of the tension, stress, but also a way of communicating or learning to communicate better, with your music. It's very helpful. Poetry too. I do both. I used to sit at the end of sessions. I'd go find solace in the legislative chamber because there's really no peaceful place, and you can't bring a phone in there. So I'd sit at my desk and I think, these moments, not all the time, obviously, but these moments I'd get, and I'm going up to the chambers, and I just began to work on some of the music or some of the poetry up there. Always kept a guitar in the office as well. Again, sometimes that's the way you break the ice with people that have English as a second language who are coming into the office, so you try a little music to start out. I had other legislators who had trauma. My office was an open office, so they would come into the office and we might talk music to get them away from talking about the legislative trauma, which can trigger people. So, yeah, I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but that's what I do with it. It's very much a part of my life. I miss it. I travel as much as I can with that little portable backpack guitar, because if I can get 10 minutes at night, in a room to play just a little bit, sometimes that's enough to
Yeah.
remind me. And sometimes I try to capture I've written a couple songs from stuff being on the road, like in Bethel, and during all the disasters that were happening one after another. I did some writing about that too.
I don't know if people ask you about that part of your life a lot, but I found it interesting, and I'm also a musician, so
Oh,
I respect
cool.
that. And
May I ask what you play?
I play guitar and
Yeah.
piano and drums, pretty much whatever I can get my hands on.
Yeah, I love that. That's very similar to me. Whatever I can get my hands on, I'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Saxophone, I figured it out. When I was at the UAA dorms, they had just opened, and I would go by three roommates, so I would have to leave and go into the parking lot to play the sax. 'Cause it's really bad when you're beginning to play sax. It doesn't work very well for me.
Governor Dunleavy has historically had a contentious relationship with public education,
Yes.
and that includes the university over the course of his time in office. And I'm wondering how you plan to work with the university and the Board of Regents if you are elected.
Well, first, with the governor in 2019, he demanded a $70 million cut. And at that point, I was minority leader, and I worked with the majority in the Senate. At that point, the president was Kathy Giesel, with the House Speaker, Bryce Edgmond, and with the House Minority Leader, Lance Pruitt. And while Lance Pruitt didn't necessarily agree with us, the other three of us agreed that those cuts were too draconian. And it began with meetings in late July, early August of 2019 with the Board of Regents themselves. I went before them and just said, look, John Davies, I think, was still president of the Board of Regents at the time. And I was, I'm asking you guys to take a pause. He is the governor, but we're the legislature, and three leaders are here saying, be patient. We think we can work this out. And it took really months of negotiating with the governor to get him to back off of that particular series of dramatic operating budget cuts. What we also recognized during that time, the 4 years I was minority leader, was the importance of actually funding basic structural functions at the university. And so those, what we call deferred maintenance, these are the things we're not, when we know there's a problem with a boiler or a building and we don't repair it, it becomes deferred maintenance. We're deferring paying the maintenance costs. What happens eventually, the building breaks down and you have to replace the whole building, and it's 3 or 4 times the cost. Are you aware that there's roughly $2 billion in deferred maintenance right now in the university system? That's enough to crush any system. So part of that has had to be, how do you negotiate with a legislature that claims there's no money? And how do you negotiate when we were there with the governor when he is so antithetical to spending money? And we literally would show him anecdotal stories, and that seemed to have an impact. By the way, both his daughters went to UAF, so that actually was helpful in us kind of getting him to see in real time, in real life, that those buildings were falling down. That's why he didn't veto the $20 million I put in the budget for the IT system for the University of Alaska. It hadn't been updated since the 90s. Think about that for a minute. You guys weren't even born when that system was built. And I had a staffer, and I just said to him, this guy is younger than the IT system at the university, and he can drink. This is a problem. Yeah. So he got that. So you have, it's really was anecdotal 101 ways of getting to him. My way of doing that is I've pointed this out. You probably heard it on that interview, but there's no communication between the governor and the legislature really now effectively, unless a surrogate, myself or others, are called on to actually, because we can communicate with him. You're right. So to talk to him. So I've said, if you have a governor who is co-aligned with majorities in the House and the Senate that see the same value of the university and the education system, then it's a matter of literally accessing the money that has been left on the table. And what I mean by that is the $35 million that we clearly know we would be collecting annually if the internet fee had passed. It did pass if it hadn't been vetoed by the governor. And that was tied to education funding, by the way, for K-12. And number two, if we fix the Hill Corp exception, which I've been talking about for over a year now, and that exception, because Hill Corp is what's called an S Corp, which is designed to help promote our businesses by exempting them from the corporate income tax. Hill Corp is a Texas-based company. It bought major oil assets from British Petroleum, and it took those assets off our corporate income tax books. It also sent a message to all those other companies that potentially they can go off the book as well. And if that happens, there won't be a university system, there won't be an education system, because that corporate income will go away, and it represents a substantial portion of our budget, roughly a fifth of it. So think about that for a minute. That second thing is worth about at least 100 million. The Senate Resources Committee says it's worth 150. And then getting rid of the oil and gas tax credits on the three legacy fields, Prudhoe, Cupric, and Alpine. I've talked about that everywhere as well. If you did that, my estimate is 250 million based on when I was in the Senate. The Senate Resources Committee says that's worth more than that, and they don't want to go as far as I want to go. They say it's worth 400 or 450 million. If you just take my estimate, we're at just under $500 million that we are not collecting. You can take some of that resource, put it in the permanent fund, some you can use to fully fund K-12, pre-K-12 education. And then you can also be working some of that funding into dealing with deferred maintenance, not just for the university, but elsewhere. I have a lot more thoughts on that, but they're complicated. And if you want to ask me about that, I can answer that next. But
So, given Alaska's, long time history and dependence on oil revenue and oil corporations, what would you do differently as governor when public interest conflicts with oil corporations' interests?
public interest comes first for me, buddy. Just to be blunt, I think we've gone way too long allowing the largest multinational corporations in the world take full advantage of our resources when every other state, especially the red states, are jamming them for full value. It's absolutely ludicrous that we don't even come close to the royalty rates of Texas and North Dakota. But the bottom line is to break our dependency on them completely. And that's my long-term goal. And so and by the way, I've been attacked for it too, because, oh, you're anti-oil. I'm not anti-oil. I'm pro-world. And part of that is, China's not suffering right now in East Asia, despite the fact that the Gulf of Hormuz is closed. And they're not, because they actually understood 2 decades ago that moving towards various types of a broad array of renewables would make them independent for energy. And so while they still do burn some coal and they still use natural gas and they still use oil, they have substantial revenue. I mean, not revenue, but energy that's produced from solar, wind, hydropower, and other clean forms of energy. And this state is replete with those very same forms of energy, and yet we do not actualize them. You want to attract young people to Alaska? Well, let's make us the mecca for alternative energy development up here. Why? Because not only do we have access to geothermal, tidal, ocean, in-stream hydro, and I actually saw a coil beneath the parking lot of the Search Hospital producing their heat. It's a coil that gathers ground heat and pumps it into the building underneath their parking lot. And it's part of how they're heating that new building. There are so many, both passive as well as attentive ways to generate energy up here. Sea Life Center is generated from the differential between the top of the resurrection arm water temperature and the bottom. It turns a turbine that heats the building at 68. And if you've been to the building, it's massive. So just thinking about that their energy is produced that way, 95% of Kodiak is renewable today, that borough. What are we doing that we are still dependent at the whims of an oil and gas industry? And you know why they paid $165 million 2 weeks ago for those leases? They paid that much money because there's no secure oil and gas region in the world today, thanks to the president. So we literally have bombed Nigeria on Christmas Day, which is the oil producer for sub-Saharan Africa, one of the major ones. We put troops in Ecuador less than 2 months ago. We uncoupled the Venezuelan government. We destabilized the Mexican government. We did all of this. And now we've taken and destroyed 17% of the natural gas infrastructure in the world. And we're about to, quote, bomb them to hell, whatever that means, to the Iranian oil economy. So we're literally looking at a situation where oil prices won't be going down and there's no stable region for them to actually manage their oil. That's why they bought those leases. They didn't buy any leases 3 years ago when the Biden administration put them up. We couldn't give them away. We bought them ourselves. We bought our own leases because nobody else would buy them. Ada bought the 2 leases that were sold in that sale. I don't think that that's our future. I think the permanent fund is our future. It's a renewable resource called capital. And we get 60% plus of our income from that renewable resource today. We get about 30, just under 30% from oil and gas royalties and taxes. My goal over a 20-year period, I won't be there for it, but to set in motion our breaking of our dependency on that oil and gas, our removal of our communities from dependency on diesel fuel, on natural gas, to move us away from that. And to do so, you can't shut it off overnight because we don't have the infrastructure to do that. What we can do is build the infrastructure up while we wean ourselves away from it. That's exactly how we deal. You don't cold turkey to get rid of an addict. What you got to do is you've got to get them weaned off of the drug. And that is my goal. That's part of why I actually got in this race, to move us to an affordable energy economy that is renewable. And I'm certain we can do it. We have the assets, and guess what? We now have the best bargaining position we've ever had with the oil industry, because they cannot leave. They will not leave. That's been their threat for 30 years, and this is the one time I can guarantee you they have no place to go. So let's bargain hard. Let's get the right deal for our oil and gas wealth. And for goodness sakes, if we are going to have people in that industry working here, let them live here too, so they pay their property taxes. 24% of our workforce doesn't even live here. You know, it's doctors and nurses too. Don't get me wrong, but 24%. Anyway, again, long answer, but you needed to know this is a very different campaign than what other people are talking about.
I'm recognizing that. Yeah, I
unabashed about it.
Would resonate with what you're saying. Actually, you're mentioning anti-imperialist positions. You're mentioning China's, which is known as, like, state socialist communist country, as something to look at as maybe not necessarily as an ideal, because they have their downsides as well, understandably, but
I'm a strong believer in democracy too. You know, that I've been fighting for it all my life. But look, they saw something that I spoke about it. You can look it up. I think it's called whale oil. You can find it on the internet. But it's a speech I gave back in 2017 where I cited those data points back when they weren't as robust as they are now. But it's not just China. Scotland is virtually independent when it comes to renewable energy, and the UK as a whole is 50% at that mark. They crossed last year the 50% mark of dependency on on renewables. Think about that for a minute. The whole world except this country is moving away from oil and gas. You know who else is? Shell Oil. And you know what BP's actual name is? It changed their name in 2000, I think 1 or 2, to Beyond Petroleum, not British Petroleum. And the reason they did that is they have heavily invested in portfolios of renewables, just like Shell Oil did, just like Exxon is doing. Santos does this. They have 4 hubs, or is it 5? I forget now whether it's 4 or 5. Santos has these hubs all around the world that are developing alternative energy and alternative food source. So think about this for a minute. These companies figured it out 25 years, 30 years ago, and their planners probably figured it out 50 years ago. And they just snow us on, and we're going to be left holding a very, very, very carbon-coated bag that isn't going to move us anywhere.
Yeah.
So I'm not for that view of Alaska. I have a different view of Alaska. I want it to be the innovative, creative place it was as I was growing up. And I want to have an entire generation of people in their 20s and 30s shaping these policies. And I want to protect them. When they make a mistake, I'm going to back them up. And when they move us forward because they are radically thinking about the future they must live in, I want to be the person who's there helping them define what that looks like, giving them the support they need, not shutting them down and pushing them to the side, which I see over and over again from people who are leading this state and people who have led other states as well. I'm done with that. Look, the time is limited. This is our opportunity. We will not get this opportunity again. It will not come our way.
So we talked a little bit earlier about the panel. I noticed in the comments that her name was Krista Howell. She talked about how her preschool was expecting funds from the government and then it was just dropped.
Yeah,
So how can the school districts trust that you'll like actually listen to them? Like I know you have a deep connection with them,
yeah.
but there is still that like lack of trust that we've seen with former governors. So how do you plan to maintain that trust with the community?
No, well, first up, when trust is broken between government and the people of the state, it's very difficult to rebuild it because nobody believes you anymore. And
Yeah.
I get it. I understand that. But one thing I have done over the last 2 years, and I didn't do it this year, but I've gone before the Alaska Association of School Boards at their invitation, and I've spoken about these very issues and how we can actually fully fund education and how we can forward fund education. And I've actually laid it out in quite a bit of detail with those folks. And I've said these are the sources of income which I've shared with you already, and this is how we can use that income. So the 185 million is approximately, call it 200 million, is what we appropriated to address raising the BSA. So if you took an additional 220 million annually, which I've identified 420 million, and that's not even counting the profit from the one-time money that we get from the war. Forget that for now. Don't even worry about that. Just in that little bit of revenue I identified from the oil industry and the internet fee, you would have enough to not just fully fund education, but to fully fund the READS Act, which is the one rolling pre-K into the base student allocation. What that means is that district, I missed that in the chat. So if you can tell me or if you got a screenshot of it, I want to know which school district that is, because that is in state law that those districts have to be rolled into the base student allocation with their pre-K programs within 6 years of that bill passing. And that bill passed in 2022, became active at fiscal year 23, which means it's by fiscal year 29, every district has to be in it. I intend to fully fund it. I control that department as the governor. I do not control the budget. The legislature does. But what I plan to do is meet with those legislators in the House and the Senate well before they get sworn into office. After they've been elected, I'll be sworn in. I want to meet with them, identify those priorities, begin the conversation in advance so we can actually be moving forward on that together. I don't plan to veto any education money that comes to Alaska if it's out there to improve education outcomes. And I know about those outcomes because I wrote the READS Act, or a good portion of it, alongside Michael Johnson, who was the Commissioner of Education at the time, and quite frankly, the governor, because he wanted a reading program that worked. What he didn't do is follow it up with the funding you needed to make the preschool piece of it happen. And the reading doesn't work if kids don't come prepared to learn. And that's what the preschool part did. So those are the things that in particular is something I want to prioritize. If you look at my website, it prioritizes education, affordable energy, and a fiscal plan to pay for it. And then out of that, you also get housing issues, and I have a lot of thoughts on that, and the idea of universal medical care, which we can do. We have the capacity to do it, and if it's successful, we have the capacity to expand on that success. Remember, if we're producing a renewable resource called capital, and we grow that permanent fund, I'm not talking about the dividend, I like the dividend, but the fund, we continue to grow that fund, There is literally nothing you will not, I mean, you will be able to do it all. You will not be subject to whims. Even in the past, the volatility of the market has damaged the permanent fund. But in this most recent collapse and up and down of the market that we've had in the last 6 months, 5 months, and in particular in the last 3 weeks, the variation was only a couple $1 billion out of an $88 billion fund, which is at 86, 87 now, but only a couple billion. That is very minor volatility in the fund, not reflecting the volatility of the market and not reflecting the volatility of oil. That is a first in the state's history. I want to know what those fund managers are doing because that's a good policy. And that's how we actually are able to continue to do this. See, people will lie to you, Beck. They're going to tell you we don't have the money to do these things. Oh, and you have to give up this or give up that. That is, man, that is a falsehood perpetrated on us by people who don't even live in this state. And they do it so they can protect their profits, and I'm done with it. And I mean, I grew up here. I was born in this state. I'm going to die in this state. I grew up here. And I cannot begin to tell you how every community I go to, and I talk about this, everyone goes, it is right. That is our fair share. And we deserve to get it. It's not greedy, it's fair. And it's fair enough that they'll still make a profit. 10 largest, I mean, for 10 years, these have been some of the largest profit-making companies, not gross or anything, profit-making companies. They need to pay their share, and that's how you get that funded education, and that's how you fund that pre-K program, which is in state law to be rolled into the base student allocation, which is our fundamental way we pay for education up here.
You actually answered my second question, so I'll just hop down to my last one.
But I want to know what your second one was. What was it?
It was just talking about oil, and like what you plan to do with like the businesses who do protect profit over people.
Yeah, that's clear. I think I've made that extraordinarily clear. And look, I support, there's a number of businesses that rely on servicing the oil industry, but they also service building schools and they service other things. And what I want to say is, look, let's sit down and figure out how we do that. I don't want to crash the economy. What I want to do is redeploy the economy. And that is a very, very different thing. And the governor can lead in that role by convening people and saying, let's talk about what the future looks like, not treading water, because it's always been this way, so it must always be this way. You and I both know that is not true. It has not always been this way, and it will always be different tomorrow. The river's never the same each time you step in it. Heraclitus, right? You got to understand that you will understand, the two of you will understand better what you face in this coming world than I will. I recognize that. That's why I need to tap the expertise of those who are growing up in this world to try to address the issues you will face that are on the horizon. We're the ones who made climate change happen as rapidly as it happened. You're the ones who have to bear the burden of solving that, and our obligation is to make a path for you to do so.
Just last question. There are a lot of different communities in Alaska. How do you plan to work with the rural communities as well as like policies that mostly impact like Anchorage?
Oh, well, so I cut my teeth in rural Alaska. Most of the work I did as community justice coordinator for Alaska when I was at the Alaska Native Justice Center running the restorative justice programs, when I was at Cook Inlet Tribal Council where I worked in their village services programs. Most of that work was in rural Alaska. I've probably been to maybe 2/3 of the villages in the state and all the small towns for sure, but at least 2/3, except for in Alaska. I've flown there 3 times, but the plane has never landed. So I've always had to do that work remotely. But I've slept on gym floors in most of those communities, or in one case in Point Hope, I actually slept in a jail cell because that's all that was available. But whether it was helping build a playground in Breivik Mission, helping Elam, and sorry about the thumb, I don't know how that happens. It's beyond me. But helping set up Elam and Koyuk's, helping set up their community court or Togiak's court, to working, with Upiat School District in Akiachek, Akiak and Tuluksuk on improving education in that community, uh, working with the Arts Council in Dillingham and being down on and working with juvenile justice in Craig and Klawock. And I mean, that's what I've done. And my understanding and commitment to rural Alaska is deep. I'm the only person who's been to many of the smaller sized cities like Wrangell and Petersburg on this campaign, Metlakatla, Craig, Klawock, names I've already mentioned to you. But I have a deep and abiding connection and have been endorsed by many Alaska Native leaders, and precisely because I have that deep connection. And to be fair, my father was revered in rural Alaska, and I humbly understand the impact he had, and I don't pretend to match it. But what I do pretend, not pretend, but what I do intend to do is emulate that same caring for culture that he evidenced as a young man when he was running for office. But again, Amonic, Mountain Village, Kotlik, Chivak, I mean, I could go on and on.
Mhm.
I won't, because there's a song about that.
Well, thank you so much for
Thanks.
taking the time to talk to us.